Your dog is creating an unacceptable noise disturbance and must be removed from the property within 30 days. That's what the certified letter said, arriving on a Tuesday morning while I was working from home, my supposedly disruptive golden retriever sleeping quietly under my desk like he did every single day. I remember staring at those words, then looking down at Cooper, who was dreaming peacefully with his paws twitching, probably chasing rabbits in whatever gentle world dogs visit when they sleep. The disconnect between the accusation and reality was so absurd, I actually laughed out loud. If you've ever been accused of something you absolutely didn't do, if you've ever felt the ground shift under you when authority figures decide facts don't matter as much as their narrative, drop a comment below. Because what started as a ridiculous complaint about a quiet dog led me down a path that exposed corruption, fraud, and the kind of secrets that people threaten lawsuits to protect. My name is James Cooper, and before I semi-retired at 43 to freelance from home, I spent 20 years as a forensic accountant. Not the sexy TV version with dramatic courtroom reveals, but the tedious, detail-oriented kind where you spend months tracking money through shell companies and fake invoices until you find the thread that unravels everything. I'd worked on corporate fraud cases, divorce settlements, insurance scams, even a few criminal investigations where following the money told you exactly who was lying and what they were hiding. I thought I was done with that world, thought I'd paid my dues, earned the right to work in pajamas with a dog at my feet, taking consulting jobs when they interested me, and declining everything else. My wife, Sarah, was a graphic designer who also worked remotely, and we'd deliberately chosen this quiet subdivision specifically because it seemed low drama. Oakmont Estates, 35 houses on curved streets with decent-sized lots, mature trees, a small community center, and an HOA that seemed more focused on organizing the annual block party than enforcing nitpicky rules. Cooper had been part of our family for 3 years, adopted from a rescue organization when he was 6 months old. Golden retrievers are supposed to be energetic and boisterous, the kind of dogs that bark at everything and demand constant attention. Cooper was the opposite. Gentle, quiet, almost comically well-behaved. He'd bark maybe twice a week, usually when a delivery truck pulled into our driveway, and even then it was more of an announcing woof than actual barking. Our neighbors loved him. Mrs. Patterson next door would bring him treats and ask to borrow him for walks because his calm presence helped with her anxiety. The Jenkins family across the street had 3 young kids who'd come over specifically to play with Cooper in our backyard, their parents thanking us for having such a patient, gentle dog their children could safely interact with. Even grumpy Mr. Henderson 2 houses down, who complained about everything from lawn care to holiday decorations, had admitted Cooper was the best-behaved dog in the neighborhood. So when the letter arrived accusing Cooper of being a noise disturbance, my first reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. Someone had made a mistake, mixed up addresses, filed a complaint about the wrong property. These things happened. I'd call the HOA, clarify the situation, and whoever was actually causing noise issues would get the appropriate notice. The letter was signed by Richard Vance, HOA president, someone I'd met exactly once during our move-in 3 years ago. He'd seemed professional enough then, mid-50s, retired from some corporate job, the kind of person who volunteers for HOA leadership because they need something to do with their time. The letter included specific complaints, excessive barking during daytime hours, nighttime disturbances, failure to control pet noise despite multiple verbal warnings. I'd received 0 verbal warnings. Not a single conversation, phone call, or informal mention that anyone had issues with Cooper. And excessive barking. I worked from home. I was here literally all day, every day. If Cooper barked excessively, I'd be the first person to know about it. I called the HOA management office, got transferred to Richard Vance's voicemail, and left a polite message explaining there must be some mistake. Cooper wasn't a nuisance barker. I'd never received verbal warnings, and I'd be happy to discuss this misunderstanding at his convenience. He called back that evening while I was making dinner, his tone pleasant but firm in the way people sound when they've already made up their minds and are just going through the motions of appearing reasonable. "Mrs. Lawson, I appreciate you calling, but we've received multiple complaints over the past 6 months about your dog's noise. We've documented each one, sent you courtesy notices, and given you plenty of opportunity to address the situation voluntarily." "Mr. Vance, I've never received any courtesy notices. The letter I got today is the first communication I've had from the HOA about Cooper. According to our records, we've sent 3 prior notices via email to the address on file. Perhaps they went to spam?" I pulled up my email on my laptop while still on the phone, searching every folder including spam and trash for anything from the HOA. I'm looking right now. No emails about Cooper, no complaints, nothing. What email address are you sending to? He recited an email address that wasn't mine, wasn't even close. Someone had fat-fingered the entry or deliberately entered wrong information, and now they were claiming I'd been properly notified via messages sent to an address I didn't own. That's not my email, I said, feeling the first spark of irritation. My correct email is on all my HOA paperwork, including the form I filled out when we moved in. Someone entered the wrong address in your system. Be that as it may, we have documentation showing attempts at communication. And regardless of notification issues, the complaints exist. Multiple neighbors have reported noise disturbances from your property. Which neighbors? I asked, because I've talked to everyone on our street and they all love Cooper. Mrs. Patterson next door actively seeks him out. The Jenkins family lets their kids play with him. Nobody has mentioned any issues. Complaint details are confidential to protect the privacy of those who filed them, but I can assure you the complaints are legitimate and documented. The conversation was going in circles, both of us stating positions that couldn't be reconciled. He had complaints I'd never heard about, sent to an email I didn't have, regarding a dog that didn't match the behavior being described. Mr. Vance, I'd like to provide evidence that Cooper isn't a noise disturbance. I work from home and can document his actual behavior. I can get statements from neighbors. Would that be helpful in resolving this? The HOA board has already reviewed the complaints and made our determination. The 30-day deadline stands. If you want to appeal, you can request a hearing at the next board meeting, but you'll need to comply with the removal requirement pending resolution. You want me to get rid of my dog for 30 days while we figure out that these complaints are wrong? We want you to address the noise disturbance you've been creating. How you choose to do that is your decision. The call ended with nothing resolved, and I sat at my kitchen table trying to understand what was happening. Cooper was lying on the floor nearby, his tail thumping gently when I looked at him, completely unaware that someone wanted him gone. Daniel got home from his gym session and found me researching HOA bylaws on my laptop with growing frustration. I explained the situation, showed him the letter, walked him through the phone call with Richard Vance. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel said, reading the letter again. "We're here all day. We'd know if Cooper was barking constantly. And why wouldn't neighbors talk to us directly before filing complaints?" "Because there are no complaints," I said. "Or, if there are, they're fabricated." Vance claimed they sent prior notices to a completely wrong email address. That's either incompetent or deliberate. Why would they deliberately target Cooper? What's the angle? That was the question I couldn't answer. Random HOA power trip? Personal vendetta from someone we didn't even know we'd offended? Mistake that snowballed because admitting error would make them look bad? I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. Set up a decibel meter app on my phone, recording ambient noise levels throughout the day. Cooper's occasional barks registered at normal dog volumes, nowhere near excessive. Got written statements from 5 neighbors confirming Cooper was quiet and well-behaved. Mrs. Patterson wrote a particularly strong letter defending him and questioning who could possibly be complaining about the gentlest dog in the neighborhood. I submitted everything to the HOA via email and certified mail, wanting documentation that I'd provided proof these complaints were baseless. Requested a hearing at the next board meeting to present my evidence formally. Richard Vance responded with a 2-sentence email. Evidence received. Hearing scheduled for March 15th at 7 p.m. 30-day removal deadline remains in effect. The hearing was 3 weeks away. The removal deadline was in 10 days. The math didn't work unless the goal was to force us into non-compliance regardless of evidence. I wasn't panicking yet, more puzzled than worried. The evidence was overwhelmingly in Cooper's favor. No reasonable board would uphold the complaint once they saw decibel readings, neighbor statements, and the fact that prior notices went to a fake email address. This would get resolved, probably with an apology for the administrative error, and life would return to normal. That assumption lasted until I checked the HOA's website to confirm meeting details and happened to click through to the financial documents section. HOAs in our state are required to post annual budgets, spending reports, and major contracts for member review. Most people never look at them, but 20 years of forensic accounting had trained me to find financial documents inherently interesting in the same way some people find Sudoku puzzles satisfying. Oakmont Estates had 35 homes paying $150 monthly dues, generating about $63,000 annually. The posted budget showed reasonable expenses: landscaping for common areas, liability insurance, management fees, maintenance reserves. Nothing alarming. But there was one line item that made me pause: community center renovation, Phase 2, $127,000 ongoing. I'd lived here 3 years and never noticed any community center renovation. The community center was a small building at the neighborhood entrance, maybe 1,500 square feet, used for HOA meetings and the occasional resident gathering. What renovation could possibly cost $127,000 and still be ongoing after appearing in both last year's and this year's budgets? I clicked through to the contract section, found the vendor agreement for the renovation work. Summit Construction Services, a contract dated 18 months ago for comprehensive interior and exterior improvements, structural upgrades, and modernization of facilities. The thing was, the community center looked exactly the same as it had when we moved in. Same paint, same landscaping, same everything. If $127,000 of work was happening, where was the evidence? I pulled up Google Maps, zoomed in on the community center. Street view images from 3 months ago showed the building unchanged. Drove past it later that afternoon on the way to the grocery store, slowed down to really look at it. No construction equipment, no dumpsters, no materials, no signs of any work whatsoever. Maybe the work was all interior. But we'd had HOA meetings there. The building looked the same inside too. Same tired carpet, same folding tables, same nothing that suggested 6 figures of renovation work. I went back to the HOA website, started clicking through older financial documents. The Summit construction contract appeared 18 months ago. Payments were being made monthly, $7,000 to $8,000 per month, steady as clockwork. Over 18 months, that added up to roughly $130,000 paid to a vendor whose work was completely invisible. My forensic accountant instincts were humming now, that particular sensation you get when numbers don't tell the story they're supposed to tell. I Googled Summit Construction Services, found a bare-bones website with generic construction photos and a contact form but no actual portfolio of completed projects. Searched for business registration, found a corporate filing from 2 years ago listing a registered agent, but no physical business address beyond a P.O. box. Not necessarily damning. Small contractors sometimes operated lean, especially in the beginning. But combined with invisible renovation work and steady monthly payments, the pattern was starting to look familiar. The kind of familiar I'd seen in corporate fraud cases where fake vendors existed solely to funnel money out of legitimate accounts. I created a spreadsheet, started tracking payments to Summit Construction, noted dates, amounts, what budget line items they were coded against, pulled up previous year's financial reports, looking for other vendors with similar patterns. Found 3 more. Greenscape Property Services, supposedly handling enhanced landscaping, $42,000 over the past year. Martinez HVAC Solutions, contracted for maintenance on equipment that should have been covered under warranty, $18,000. Coleman Legal Consulting, providing unspecified legal services, $23,000. I Googled each vendor. Greenscape had a website that looked exactly like Summit's, generic photos, no real portfolio. Martinez HVAC had been registered 6 months before their first HOA contract and had no online presence beyond a state business filing. Coleman Legal Consulting didn't exist in any searchable form beyond being listed as a vendor on our HOA reports. 4 vendors, over $200,000 in the past 18 months, and I couldn't find evidence any of them were real companies performing actual work. I sat back from my laptop, feeling that old familiar rush of pieces clicking together. This wasn't about Cooper. This had never been about Cooper. A quiet dog suddenly becoming a noise disturbance, complaints that didn't match reality, a removal demand that made no sense. It was pressure, harassment designed to create stress, force compliance, maybe encourage us to just sell and leave rather than fight. And if someone was pressuring us, there had to be a reason. What was special about our property, our location? I pulled up a map of Oakmont Estates, marked our house with a red dot. We were on Maple Court, 3rd house from the corner. Normal lot, nothing particularly special about location or view. But we did back up to common property, the small strip of land where the community center sat. From our back deck, I had a clear view of the community center parking lot and rear entrance. Could see when people came and went, what vehicles were there, whether any work was happening. If someone was running fake construction contracts and occasionally needed to create the appearance of activity, having a witness who worked from home and looked out at the property all day might be inconvenient. I thought about the past few months, tried to remember if I'd seen unusual activity at the community center. There had been a few times, late evening or early morning, when I'd noticed a pickup truck in the parking lot. Never thought much about it at the time. People used the community center for meetings, stored equipment there, occasionally did legitimate maintenance. Nothing that seemed suspicious in the moment. But if someone was creating fake paper trails for construction work that wasn't happening, they'd need to occasionally stage evidence. Bring in a truck, move some materials around, create the appearance of activity in case anyone was paying attention. And if the person doing that noticed someone's house had a direct line of sight to their staging area, they might want that someone distracted, stressed, worried about losing their dog, not spending time looking out their back window and wondering what was happening at the community center. I could be wrong, could be connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. 20 years of forensic accounting sometimes made you see conspiracies and coincidence, but the numbers didn't lie. Over $200,000 paid to vendors I couldn't verify for work I couldn't see, while the HOA president manufactured complaints about a dog to pressure the one resident whose house overlooked the staging area. Daniel found me still at my laptop at midnight, spreadsheet open, 3 pages of notes about vendor patterns and payment timing. You okay? You've been staring at that screen for 6 hours. Richard Vance is embezzling from the HOA, I said, and he's trying to force us out because we can see the community center from our house. That's a serious accusation. Are you sure? I turned the laptop to show him the spreadsheet, walked him through the fake vendors, the invisible renovation work, the timing of payments, and the suspicious pattern of contracts that appeared right after Vance became HOA president 2 years ago. I can't prove it yet, I admitted, but I know what fraud looks like, and this looks like fraud. He's created shell companies, written fake contracts, and been systematically billing the HOA for work that isn't happening, probably diverting the money to accounts he controls. And Cooper is leverage. Make us stressed and distracted, maybe force us to sell. Remove the witness who has the best view of his staging area. The dog was never the point. We are. Daniel sat down heavily, processing. What do we do? I looked at Cooper, sleeping peacefully under my desk, completely oblivious to being a pawn in someone else's fraud scheme. Looked at my spreadsheet full of numbers that told a story of theft and corruption. Looked at my husband, who'd married a forensic accountant and was now remembering exactly what that meant. We do what I always did when someone was stealing, I said. We follow the money until we find proof, and then we make sure everyone knows exactly what Richard Vance has been hiding. Cooper's tail thumped gently in his sleep, maybe sensing my determination, maybe just dreaming his peaceful dog dreams. He had no idea he'd stumbled into being the distraction in an embezzlement scheme. But his owner? His owner knew exactly how to take apart fraudulent accounting, expose fake vendors, and document theft. It was literally what I'd done for 2 decades. Richard Vance had tried to pressure the wrong house, and now he was about to discover what happens when you threaten a forensic accountant's dog. The game was on, whether he realized it yet or not. The next morning, I did what any reasonable person would do when accused of having a disruptive dog while simultaneously discovering potential embezzlement. I set up surveillance, not the high-tech kind you see in movies. Just my old laptop positioned on the back deck with a clear view of the community center, running free-screen recording software that captured everything happening in the parking lot. If Richard Vance was staging fake construction activity, I wanted documentation, dates, times, vehicles, everything that would prove the $127,000 renovation was fiction. Cooper joined me on the deck, sprawling in a patch of morning sunlight, living his best quiet life while supposedly being such a noise disturbance that he needed to be removed from the property. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had taken the day off work, partially to support me, partially because she was genuinely worried I was about to pick a fight with the HOA that could make our lives miserable. James, are you sure about this? Maybe the renovation work happened before we moved in. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation. For 4 fake vendors billing over $200,000 with no visible work. I pulled up my spreadsheet, showing her the payment patterns I'd been tracking since midnight. Look at this. Summit Construction gets paid $7,000 to $8,000 every single month like clockwork. Not invoiced for completed work, not tied to project milestones, just steady monthly payments that look exactly like a salary being disguised as contract work. She studied the numbers, her graphic designer's eye picking up on the pattern immediately. That's not how legitimate construction billing works. Exactly. Real contractors invoice for materials, labor hours, completed phases. This is just monthly cash going out the door with generic line items like ongoing renovation work and materials and labor. It's a template someone's copying and pasting, barely even trying to make it look legitimate. I'd spent the early morning hours diving deeper into the rabbit hole, and what I'd found made the picture even clearer. Summit Construction Services was registered to a business address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox. The registered agent was someone named Michael Torres, but searching that name alongside the business turned up nothing. No LinkedIn profile, no contractor licensing, no social media presence, nothing that suggested an actual human being running an actual construction company. Greenscape Property Services had the same registered agent. So did Martinez HVAC Solutions. 3 supposedly independent companies, all registered within months of each other, all sharing the same registered agent who didn't seem to exist outside of state business filings. Coleman Legal Consulting was slightly different, registered to an address that was actually a real office building in the city. But when I called the building's main office number and asked to be transferred to Coleman Legal, the receptionist told me no such business operated there. The address was just another mailbox service, same as the UPS store, a legal business address that provided no actual business presence. These are shell companies, I told Sarah, pulling up the business registration documents on my laptop. Someone created fake businesses, gave them plausible names, filed minimal paperwork to make them look legitimate, and then started billing the HOA for work that never happened. The money goes into accounts controlled by whoever set this up, and it looks like legitimate business expenses on the HOA books. And you think Richard Vance is behind it? He's the president. He approves contracts and payments. He'd need to be involved, either as the mastermind or a willing participant. Either way, he's signing off on paying over $200,000 to vendors that don't exist. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said something that made my investigative instincts perk up. What about the HOA treasurer? Don't they review and approve expenses too? I pulled up the HOA website, navigated to the board member page. Richard Vance, president. Linda Martinez, vice president. Tom Bradshaw, secretary. And the treasurer position was listed as currently vacant, duties assumed by president. The treasurer position has been vacant for 18 months, I said slowly, checking the historical board records. Right around the time the first fake vendor contract appeared, Vance has been doing double duty as president and treasurer, which means he has complete control over approving contracts and authorizing payments. That's not normal, right? HOAs usually require multiple people to sign off on large expenses? They absolutely should, and I guarantee the bylaws require it. But if nobody's paying attention, if residents just trust that the board is handling finances properly, you can get away with a lot before anyone notices. I pulled up the HOA bylaws, found the section on financial controls. Look at this. Any expenditure over $10,000 requires board approval and 2 signatures on payment authorization. But Vance has been the only person signing off on these contracts because he's acting as both president and treasurer. The surveillance camera on my laptop pinged with a motion alert. I switched to the live view and saw a white pickup truck pulling into the community center parking lot. 7:30 in the morning, no visible company logos on the truck, a single person getting out and walking around to the bed to pull out some plastic tarps and a few pieces of lumber. Sarah, come look at this. We watched as the man, maybe late 20s, laid out the tarps near the community center entrance, arranged the lumber in a semi-organized pile, then took several photos with his phone. The whole performance took maybe 10 minutes. Then he loaded everything back into the truck and drove away. What was that? Sarah asked. That was someone creating evidence. Take photos of materials on site, submit them with an invoice showing delivery and installation, bill the HOA for work that never actually happened. I bet you anything there'll be a charge on next month's expenses labeled something like exterior trim materials and installation for $3,000. I saved the video clip, noted the date and time, captured screenshots of the truck and license plate. If this went where I thought it was going, documentation would be everything. Cooper barked once. a single woof at a squirrel that had ventured too close to the deck. Sarah and I both looked at each other and burst out laughing at the absurdity. That one bark was literally the only sound he'd made all morning, and according to the HOA, he was such an excessive noise problem that he needed to be removed from the property. "I'm recording his behavior too," I said, gesturing to my phone running the decibel monitoring app, building a counter case showing he's not a disturbance. But honestly, the more I dig into this, the more I think the dog complaint was just a distraction. They needed us stressed and focused on fighting to keep Cooper, instead of looking at what was happening with HOA finances. Over the next 3 days, I became slightly obsessed with unraveling the scope of the fraud. I created a master timeline, cross-referencing when fake vendors appeared, when payments started, when the treasurer position became vacant, and when Richard Vance took over full financial control. The pattern was damning. Within 2 months of becoming acting treasurer, Vance had approved contracts with 3 shell companies. Within 6 months, he'd paid out over $80,000. By 18 months, the total was approaching $250,000. I filed public records requests with the state for business filings on all 4 fake vendors, wanting official documentation of registration details, tracked down the UPS store where 3 of them had mailbox addresses, and called asking if I could schedule a meeting with Summit Construction Services. The employee politely told me that mail forwarding clients weren't permitted to use the address for in-person meetings. It was mail service only. "Do you know where I could actually find them?" I asked, playing confused customer. "Sir, I can't give out client information, but I can tell you that address is just for receiving mail. If you need to meet with them, you'd have to contact them directly." Dead end by design. Everything about these companies was structured to look legitimate from a distance, while making it impossible to actually verify anything concrete. I reached out to 2 other Oakmont Estates residents who I knew had been on the HOA board in the past, before Vance's presidency. Left casual voicemails saying I had some questions about how HOA finances worked and would they have time for coffee. One didn't call back. The other, a retired teacher named Carol Henderson, agreed to meet me at a local coffee shop. Carol was in her late 60s, had lived in Oakmont Estates since the subdivision was built, and had served 2 terms as HOA secretary before deciding board politics weren't worth the stress. She arrived with a folder full of old HOA documents that she'd kept, that particular kind of organized person who never threw away official paperwork. "James, I'll be honest. I was surprised to get your call," Carol said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Most residents don't care about HOA operations until something affects them directly. What's going on?" I explained the dog complaint first, keeping it light, framing it as confusion about a complaint that didn't match reality. She frowned, shaking her head. "That doesn't sound like Richard. He's usually very by the book about complaints. If he's saying there are noise issues, there must be documentation." That's what I thought. But when I asked to see the complaints, he said they're confidential, and the prior notices he claims were sent went to an email address that isn't mine. That's odd. The HOA has always been good about keeping resident contact information current. She pulled out her phone, checked something. "I'm still on the neighborhood email list. Let me verify your address." She rattled off my correct email. "That's what I have. So if Richard sent notices to a different address, that's a mistake on his end, not yours." I decided to push a little further. "Carol, when you were on the board, how did financial approvals work? Who signed off on large contracts?" Her expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Why are you asking about finances?" "Just trying to understand how things work. The dog complaint has me looking at HOA operations more carefully, and I noticed some large expenses in the posted budgets. Curious about the approval process." She was quiet for a moment, studying me over her coffee cup. Then she said something that confirmed my suspicions were right. "When I was secretary, any contract over $10,000 required full board review and approval at a meeting. The president and treasurer both had to sign payment authorizations. We were very careful about financial controls because we'd heard horror stories from other HOAs about embezzlement." "Is that still how it works?" "It should be. That's in the bylaws. Can't be changed without a membership vote." She paused. "But I haven't been to an HOA meeting in over a year. I got tired of the politics." "Why?" I pulled out my phone, showed her the HOA website page listing Richard Vance as acting treasurer. The treasurer position has been vacant for 18 months. Vance is approving everything solo. Carol's expression went from guarded to genuinely worried. That's not supposed to happen. If the treasurer position becomes vacant, the board is supposed to appoint a replacement within 60 days. Having one person control both positions defeats the whole purpose of financial oversight. Did you know the community center renovation has cost $127,000 so far? What renovation? I was just there 2 months ago for the annual meeting. The building looks exactly the same. I showed her the budget line item, the Summit construction contract, the monthly payments that had been going out like clockwork for 18 months. Watched her face go pale as she realized what she was looking at. James, this looks like fraud. I know. I spent 20 years as a forensic accountant. I know what embezzlement patterns look like. And this is textbook. Fake vendors, inflated contracts, solo approval authority, and work that doesn't exist. Someone's been systematically stealing from the HOA, and based on the timing and authority structure, it's either Richard Vance or someone he's protecting. Carol sat back, looking genuinely shaken. I knew Richard was controlling, but I never thought, "Are you sure about this? Because if you're wrong, you're accusing the HOA president of a crime. That's serious." I'm not wrong. I've tracked over $200,000 in payments to vendors that don't exist. I've documented that the work they're supposedly doing isn't visible. I've found business registration records showing all these companies share the same fake registered agent. This isn't a mistake or misunderstanding, Carol. This is deliberate theft. What are you going to do? I'm going to that hearing on March 15th with evidence about Cooper being a quiet dog, and I'm going to request a full financial audit of HOA accounts going back 3 years. I'm going to make sure every resident knows exactly what's been happening with their money. Richard won't go down without a fight. He'll deny everything, claim you're making false accusations, maybe even threaten legal action to shut you up. Let him try. I've built fraud cases against people much smarter than an HOA president embezzling through fake construction contracts. I know how to document evidence, create timelines, and present findings that even non-accountants can understand. By the time I'm done, there won't be any doubt about what he's been doing. Carol pulled out one of the documents from her folder, an old HOA financial report from 4 years ago, before Vance became president. This might help. It shows what normal HOA expenses looked like when we had proper oversight. You can compare it to current spending patterns and show exactly how things changed after Richard took control. I thanked her, took photos of the document, and promised to keep her updated on what I found. As we were leaving, she stopped me. "James, be careful. People who steal this much money don't usually stop just because they're caught. They fight back, sometimes in ways you don't expect. If Richard realizes you're onto him, he might escalate the pressure. He already has. The dog complaint was escalation. And I'm betting once he realizes I'm not backing down, he'll find other ways to make life difficult. But that's okay. Every move he makes is just more evidence of harassment and retaliation." That night, Cooper provided the final piece of confirmation I needed. Sarah and I were in bed, windows open to the cool evening air, when Cooper started barking. Not his usual one-woof alert bark, but sustained, insistent barking directed at the backyard. I got up, looked out the back window, and saw lights in the community center parking lot. 2 vehicles, one of them the same white pickup from the staged material delivery earlier that week. 2 people were moving things around, taking photos, creating evidence for billing purposes. And Cooper was barking at them, doing exactly what any dog would do when strangers were active on adjacent property late at night. I grabbed my phone, started recording video from the window, captured clear footage of the vehicles, the people, the staged activity, and Cooper barking at the disturbance. Checked the timestamp, 11:47 p.m. "Sarah, come here. This is it. This is the noise complaint." She joined me at the window, watching the staged construction activity. They're creating fake evidence for billing. And Cooper is barking because there are strangers working on adjacent property late at night, which is completely normal dog behavior. But I'm betting this is when Vance or someone else has been filing complaints about noise disturbance. Not because Cooper is a problem, but because his barking indicates we're home, we're awake. We might look out the window and see what they're doing. The activity lasted about 20 minutes. The 2 people loaded everything back into vehicles and drove away. Cooper stopped barking immediately, came back to bed, and settled down like nothing had happened. I had it all on video. The staged activity, Cooper's response, the timestamp showing late-night work that no legitimate construction crew would be doing. It wasn't just evidence that Cooper was responding to actual disturbances rather than being randomly noisy. It was evidence that the fake construction operation needed to stage activity occasionally, and my dog's natural responses were making that uncomfortable. The pieces were all there. Fake vendors, invisible work, solo financial control, staged evidence, and a dog complaint designed to pressure the one resident whose house overlooked the operation. It was a complete pattern of fraud and harassment, documented and ready to present. I spent the next week preparing for the March 15th hearing, created a presentation with clear evidence about Cooper's behavior, neighbor statements, decibel readings, everything proving the noise complaint was baseless. But I also created a second presentation, one showing the HOA financial irregularities, the fake vendor patterns, the missing oversight controls, and the staged construction activity. 2 days before the hearing, I received another letter from Richard Vance. The HOA was fining me $500 for failure to comply with the removal deadline. Cooper was still on the property, therefore I was in violation, therefore I owed money plus $50 per day for ongoing non-compliance. Sarah was furious. "This is harassment. He's just stacking penalties hoping you'll give in." "He's creating a paper trail," I corrected, making it look like I'm a problem resident who refuses to follow rules. When I present evidence of his fraud, he'll try to discredit me by pointing to my non-compliance and multiple violations. It's a preemptive defense strategy. So, what do we do? I looked at Cooper, who was sleeping peacefully under my desk, completely oblivious to being the center of an escalating confrontation between his owner and an embezzling HOA president. "We go to that hearing," I said. "We present evidence. We force the board and other residents to see what's really happening. And we watch Richard Vance's careful fraud scheme fall apart when someone who actually knows how to investigate financial crime starts asking questions he can't answer." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Kept running through the presentation in my head, anticipating objections, preparing responses, making sure every piece of evidence was documented and defensible. 20 years of forensic accounting had taught me that the best cases weren't built on dramatic revelations. They were built on meticulous documentation that made denial impossible. Cooper sensed my restlessness, came over and put his head on my leg, that gentle weight that dogs use to remind you they're there and everything's going to be okay. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting, buddy," I told him quietly. "You're about to become the most famous dog in Oakmont Estates, not for being loud, but for accidentally exposing an embezzlement scheme just by doing normal dog things." His tail thumped gently, and I realized that's exactly what this was about. Normal dog behavior, normal resident oversight, normal expectations that people in positions of authority would act honestly. And what happens when someone violates those normal expectations so flagrantly that even a quiet golden retriever becomes evidence of their deception? The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center, the same building where over $100,000 of fictional renovation work had supposedly occurred. The irony was almost too perfect. Richard Vance had tried to pressure the wrong resident, and tomorrow night he was going to discover exactly what happens when you threaten a forensic accountant's dog and then give him 3 weeks to investigate your finances. The game was ending, whether he realized it yet or not. The community center parking lot was packed when Sarah and I arrived at 6:45. Word had apparently spread that there was going to be a hearing about the Cooper situation, and based on the number of cars, half the neighborhood had shown up to watch. Some probably came to support us, others likely came to see the problem resident who refused to comply with HOA rules finally face consequences. Cooper was home, blissfully unaware he was the subject of a community spectacle. I'd considered bringing him to demonstrate how quiet and well-behaved he was, but decided against it. This wasn't really about him anyway, and I didn't want him stressed by a room full of people. I carried 2 things into that community center, my laptop with the presentation about Cooper's behavior and a folder thick with financial documentation that was about to ruin Richard Vance's evening considerably more than he'd planned to ruin mine. The meeting room was set up with folding chairs facing a table where the HOA board sat. Richard Vance in the center, looking comfortable and in control in a button-down shirt and slacks. Linda Martinez, the vice president, on his right, a woman in her 50s who I'd only met in passing. Tom Bradshaw, the secretary, on his left, looking vaguely uncomfortable to be there. About 40 residents filled the chairs, their expressions ranging from curious to judgmental to supportive. I spotted Carol Henderson in the back row, giving me a small nod. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor who loved Cooper, was sitting front and center with her arms crossed like she was ready for a fight. The Jenkins family was there with their 3 kids, who kept asking loudly when they'd get to see Cooper. Richard Vance called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, running through standard opening procedures with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd chaired dozens of these meetings. Then he got to the main agenda item, and his tone shifted to something more formal, more serious. We're here tonight to address a compliance issue with the Cooper residents regarding excessive dog noise. Mr. Cooper has requested a hearing to appeal the removal order issued 3 weeks ago. Mr. Cooper, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood, connected my laptop to the projector they'd set up, and pulled up my first presentation. The room's attention focused on the screen showing a title slide. Cooper Behavior Analysis, Evidence of Compliance. Thank you for the opportunity to present evidence, I began, keeping my tone professional and calm. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter claiming my dog Cooper creates excessive noise disturbances. This came as a surprise because Cooper is a 3-year-old golden retriever known throughout the neighborhood for being exceptionally quiet and well-behaved. I clicked to the next slide showing decibel readings from 2 weeks of monitoring. I recorded ambient noise levels from my property for 14 consecutive days. Cooper's occasional barks registered at normal dog volumes, averaging 2 to 3 vocalizations per day, typically in response to deliveries or wildlife. This is well within normal range and cannot reasonably be classified as excessive. Next slide. Written statements from 5 neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson, who was nodding vigorously in the front row. Multiple neighbors have provided statements confirming Cooper's quiet nature and questioning the validity of complaints. Mrs. Patterson, who lives directly adjacent to our property, states she actively seeks out Cooper for walks because his calm presence helps with her anxiety. I could see some residents nodding, a few whispering to each other. The Jenkins kids were telling their parents that Cooper was the best dog ever. The narrative was shifting in the room, people starting to question why this hearing was even necessary. Additionally, I continued, clicking to show the email evidence, the HOA claims 3 prior courtesy notices were sent to me via email. However, those notices were sent to an incorrect email address not associated with my account. I never received prior warning because the warnings were sent to someone else's email. Richard Vance interrupted, his voice sharp. The HOA is not responsible for resident contact information errors. If you provided incorrect information, that's not our fault. I provided correct information on my move-in paperwork 3 years ago. The error occurred in your system, not mine. Carol Henderson has confirmed my correct email is on file in the neighborhood directory. I gestured toward Carol, who raised her hand in acknowledgement. Vance's expression tightened, but he didn't push the point. I clicked to the next slide, showing the video footage from the night Cooper had barked at the staged construction activity. This video is from 11:47 p.m., 12 days ago. As you can see, there are vehicles in the community center parking lot, people moving equipment and materials, and Cooper barking in response to nighttime activity on adjacent property. This is normal protective behavior, not excessive noise disturbance. I let the video play for 30 seconds, the sound of Cooper's barking clear but not unreasonable, the image of the white pickup truck and workers staging activity completely visible. Several residents leaned forward, looking confused. Mrs. Patterson spoke up without being called on. Why are there construction workers here at midnight? That doesn't make sense for a renovation project. Richard Vance's face had gone slightly pale. That's irrelevant to the noise complaint. We're here to discuss Mr. Cooper's dog, not HOA maintenance schedules. Actually, I said, pausing the video on a clear shot of the staged materials, I think it's very relevant, because this video shows the only time Cooper has barked at night in the past 3 weeks, and it coincides with late-night activity at the community center that seems unusual for legitimate construction work. I could feel the room's attention sharpening, people starting to sense this was about more than just a dog complaint. Tom Bradshaw, the secretary, was looking at Richard Vance with an expression that suggested he hadn't been informed about midnight construction activities. I move that we accept Mr. Cooper's evidence and dismiss the noise complaint, Tom said suddenly. The documentation clearly shows normal dog behavior, not excessive disturbance. And the prior notice issue is a legitimate procedural problem that undermines the validity of the removal order. Seconded, Linda Martinez added, though she looked uncertain about what was happening. Richard Vance was losing control of his carefully planned hearing. We haven't finished discussing all the complaints. There are documented disturbances beyond what Mr. Cooper has addressed. Then show us the complaints, Carol Henderson called from the back row. You've been claiming multiple neighbors filed complaints. Let's see them. Who complained? When? What specifically did they report? Complaint details are confidential to protect resident privacy, Vance replied, but his voice had lost its confident authority. The complainants can be anonymous, but the details shouldn't be, Carol pressed. Show us the documentation. Dates, times, specific incidents. That's standard procedure for complaint verification. Vance shuffled papers on the table in front of him, clearly stalling. I don't have that level of detail available right now. The complaints are on file in our administrative records. Which you manage, I said quietly. As HOA president and acting treasurer, you control all administrative records and financial documentation, which brings me to something else I'd like to discuss with the board and residents. I could see panic flicker across Vance's face, just for a second, quickly suppressed. This hearing is about your dog, Mr. Cooper. Other matters are not on tonight's agenda. I'm requesting that the board add a discussion of HOA financial oversight to tonight's agenda. Specifically, I'm requesting a full forensic audit of HOA accounts going back 3 years. The room went silent. Every resident was now completely focused on what was happening, sensing drama that went beyond a simple dog dispute. Linda Martinez and Tom Bradshaw were both staring at Richard Vance, waiting for his response. That's an unusual request, Vance said carefully. May I ask why you're suddenly concerned about financial oversight? Because I've reviewed publicly posted HOA financial documents and identified significant irregularities that warrant investigation. I closed my Cooper presentation and opened the second folder on my laptop. Would the board like me to present my findings, or would you prefer to table this discussion for a future meeting? Tom Bradshaw spoke before Vance could respond. I'd like to hear what Mr. Cooper has found. If there are financial concerns, the board needs to know about them. I object to turning this meeting into an ambush of the HOA president, Vance said, his voice rising slightly. This is inappropriate and outside the scope of tonight's agenda. The HOA bylaws allow any resident to raise concerns for board consideration, Carol called out. She'd pulled out a physical copy of the bylaws, holding it up. Section 12, subsection 4. Any resident may request board discussion of HOA matters at any official meeting. The board can vote on whether to address the concern immediately or schedule it for future review. Linda Martinez looked at Tom Bradshaw, some silent communication passing between them. I move that we hear Mr. Cooper's financial concerns tonight. If they're serious enough to warrant an audit request, we should understand what he's found. Seconded, Tom said immediately. Richard Vance knew he was trapped. Refusing to allow discussion would look suspicious and controlling. Fine. Mr. Cooper, you have 10 minutes to present your concerns, but I want it on record that I believe this is a deliberate distraction from your non-compliance with HOA rules. I pulled up my financial presentation, the one I'd spent a week building, the one that documented every transaction, every fake vendor, every red flag that screamed embezzlement. The title slide appeared on the projector. HOA Financial Irregularities, Evidence of Fraudulent Billing Practices. You could hear the collective intake of breath from 40 residents, simultaneously realizing this was about to get very interesting. Over the past 3 weeks, while gathering evidence about Cooper's behavior, I noticed some unusual items in posted HOA financial documents. As a former forensic accountant who specialized in fraud investigation, certain patterns caught my attention. I clicked to the first evidence slide, showing the Summit Construction Services contract. 18 months ago, the HOA entered into a contract with Summit Construction Services for community center renovation work, totaling $127,000. Monthly payments of $7,000 to $8,000 have been going to this vendor consistently since then. Next slide showing photos of the unchanged community center. However, as everyone in this room can verify, no visible renovation work has been completed. The community center looks exactly as it did 3 years ago when my wife and I moved in. Murmurs spread through the crowd, residents turning to look at each other, then at the unchanged community center building they were sitting in right now. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. I've been in this neighborhood for 12 years. This building hasn't changed at all. Where did $127,000 go? I continued before Vance could respond. I researched Summit Construction Services and found they're registered to a UPS store mailbox with no physical business address. The registered agent is someone named Michael Torres, but that person has no online presence, no contractor licensing, and no verifiable existence outside of business registration documents. Next slide showing the pattern of payments. The billing pattern is inconsistent with legitimate construction work. Real contractors invoice for completed project phases, materials costs, labor hours. Summit Construction bills the exact same amount every month, regardless of work supposedly completed. This pattern is consistent with salary payments being disguised as contract work. Richard Vance stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. You're making serious accusations based on amateur investigation. Summit Construction is a legitimate vendor that was properly vetted and contracted. Then you'll have no problem providing documentation, I said calmly. Business license, contractor registration, proof of insurance, references from other clients, photos of work in progress. Standard vendor verification materials that should be on file if proper vetting occurred. Those documents are in administrative files. I don't have them available tonight. Convenient. I clicked to the next slide showing all 4 fake vendors. But Summit Construction isn't the only problematic vendor. Greenscape Property Services, billing $42,000 for enhanced landscaping that isn't visible. Martinez HVAC Solutions, $18,000 for maintenance on equipment still under manufacturer warranty. Coleman Legal Consulting, $23,000 for unspecified legal services with no actual office location. I showed the business registration documents, highlighting that 3 of the 4 companies shared the same registered agent, the same P.O. box address structure, the same lack of verifiable business presence. These 4 vendors have been paid over $200,000 in the past 18 months. None of them appear to be legitimate operating businesses. All of them started billing the HOA within months of Richard Vance becoming acting treasurer and gaining solo approval authority over financial transactions. The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of my voice. Linda Martinez was staring at the projected evidence with her hand over her mouth. Tom Bradshaw was furiously taking notes. Residents were pulling out phones, taking pictures of the slides, recording the presentation. The HOA bylaws require board approval for expenditures over $10,000 and dual signatures on payment authorizations from the president and treasurer, I continued. But the treasurer position has been vacant for 18 months, the same period when fraudulent billing began. Richard Vance has been approving and authorizing payments without the required oversight. Carol Henderson stood up, her voice clear and angry. Richard, when I was on the board, we had strict rules about filling vacant positions within 60 days. Why has the treasurer position been vacant for a year and a half? Who's been providing financial oversight? We've had difficulty finding qualified volunteers, Vance said weakly. I've been managing both roles to ensure HOA business continues. Managing both roles gives you complete control over approving fake contracts and paying fake vendors, I said, which is exactly what forensic evidence suggests has been happening. I clicked to the final slide, showing the video footage from the late-night staging activity. This video shows what appears to be staged construction activity at 11:47 p.m. Materials are arranged, photos are taken, then everything is loaded back into trucks and removed. This is consistent with creating false evidence for fraudulent billing. This is all speculation and circumstantial evidence, Vance said, but he'd lost the commanding presence he'd had at the start of the meeting. He looked cornered, desperate, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. You're creating a conspiracy theory out of normal HOA operations because you're angry about the dog complaint. Then let's resolve this simply, Tom Bradshaw said, standing up to address the room. If these allegations are false, a professional audit will clear everything up and prove the vendors are legitimate. If the allegations are true, we need to know immediately and take appropriate action. I move that we authorize an immediate forensic audit of all HOA accounts going back 3 years, conducted by an independent accounting firm not selected by the president. Seconded, Linda Martinez said, her voice shaking slightly. And I move that Richard Vance be temporarily suspended from signature authority on HOA accounts pending audit completion, with Linda Martinez and Tom Bradshaw assuming joint authority for necessary financial transactions. You can't do this, Vance said, his voice rising to near shouting. This is a witch hunt based on one resident's vendetta. I've served this community faithfully for 2 years. You've served yourself, Carol Henderson called out. You've stolen from your neighbors, created fake companies, and tried to cover it up by harassing a resident whose house overlooks your staging area. You tried to force James Cooper out because his dog barked at your midnight fraud operations. The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Residents angry and confused, board members trying to figure out next steps, Richard Vance attempting to regain control but failing as the narrative had completely escaped him. Mrs. Patterson stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. I've lived here 12 years. I've paid my HOA dues faithfully every single month. If this man has been stealing from us, I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Who seconds Tom's motion for an audit? 20 hands went up simultaneously, including Linda Martinez and Tom Bradshaw. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only Richard Vance abstaining. I'm resigning from the board effective immediately, Vance said, gathering papers with shaking hands. I won't stay where I'm not trusted. You'll regret this witch hunt when the audit comes back showing nothing wrong. If there's nothing wrong, you shouldn't need to resign, I said quietly. Innocent people welcome audits because they have nothing to hide. Vance glared at me with pure hatred, the mask of professional courtesy completely stripped away. You've destroyed a volunteer's reputation over a dog complaint. I hope you're satisfied. I documented evidence of fraud. What happens next is the consequence of your actions, not mine. He walked out without another word, leaving his papers scattered on the board table, leaving behind 2 stunned board members and 40 residents who were just beginning to process that their HOA president had likely been embezzling from them for over a year. Linda Martinez took over chairing the meeting, her voice unsteady but determined. We need to contact an attorney immediately. Tom, can you research forensic accounting firms first thing tomorrow? We need professionals to document everything properly. Already on it, Tom said, typing notes on his phone. I'll have recommendations by noon tomorrow. And the dog complaint? Mrs. Patterson prompted. Linda looked at me, then at the evidence still displayed on the projector. Motion to dismiss all complaints against the Cooper residents regarding dog noise, with apologies for the administrative errors and inappropriate targeting. All in favor? Every hand in the room went up, including the Jenkins kids who were too young to vote but raised their hands anyway because everyone else was doing it. Mr. Cooper, Linda said formally, on behalf of the HOA board, I apologize for the harassment you and your family have experienced. The dog complaint is dismissed, all fines are reversed, and we're grateful you brought these financial concerns to our attention. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, residents approaching me with questions, thanking me for investigating, asking how they could help with the audit process. Carol Henderson gave me a fierce hug, whispering, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to prove it. Thank you for having the skills and courage to expose it. Sarah squeezed my hand, looking proud and relieved and slightly overwhelmed by the drama we'd just lived through. You did it. You actually did it. Cooper did it, I corrected. He barked at the right moment, made them nervous, and they panicked by trying to force us out. If they'd left us alone, I never would have started digging into HOA finances. We drove home past the community center, its unchanged exterior a monument to 18 months of fictional renovation work. Tomorrow, forensic accountants would start tracing money through shell companies and fake invoices. Police would probably get involved once the audit confirmed fraud. Richard Vance would face consequences for stealing from his neighbors. But tonight, Cooper was just happy we were home, greeting us at the door with his tail wagging, completely unaware he'd accidentally exposed an embezzlement scheme just by being a normal dog. I gave him extra treats and a long belly rub, telling him he was the best forensic accounting assistant a former fraud investigator could ask for. He had no idea what any of those words meant, but he knew I was happy, and that was enough for him. Good boy, Cooper, I said, scratching behind his ears. Good boy. His tail thumped against the floor, the same gentle sound that had been labeled an excessive noise disturbance, the same sound that had started this entire investigation because someone made the mistake of threatening the wrong dog. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. 6 months later, I sat on my back deck watching Cooper chase butterflies in the yard, living his best life completely oblivious to the legal chaos his barking had accidentally exposed. The real work had begun the morning after that explosive HOA meeting. Tom Bradshaw had contacted 3 forensic accounting firms by 9 a.m., had proposals by end of business, and the board voted to hire the firm I'd recommended by the end of that week. The auditors had descended on HOA records like investigators at a crime scene, methodical and thorough, leaving no transaction unexamined. Within 3 weeks, they'd confirmed everything I'd suspected and uncovered details I'd missed. The fake vendors, the shell companies, the staged construction activities, all of it documented in a 47-page report that read like a manual on how not to run an HOA. Richard Vance had stolen $247,000 over 18 months, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even his attorney had advised cooperation. But Vance hadn't cooperated, had maintained his innocence, claimed the audit was biased, threatened lawsuits against the HOA and me personally for defamation. Within 6 weeks of the audit's completion, police had arrested him at his home. The charges were serious: theft, fraud, forgery, and a few other counts I'd lost track of as prosecutors built their case. And now, 6 months after that March evening, when everything had exploded, life had settled into a new normal. The community center was visible from my deck, exactly as it had been 18 months ago when Vance started billing for fictional renovation work. Only now, there was actual construction happening, legitimate contractors working during normal business hours, funded by recovered embezzled money. The forensic audit had taken 8 weeks to complete and cost the HOA $12,000, but it had been worth every penny. The accounting firm I'd recommended, the same one I'd worked with during my corporate fraud investigation days, had torn through HOA finances with the kind of methodical precision that left no room for doubt or denial. Final tally: Richard Vance had stolen $247,000 over 18 months through 4 shell companies he'd created and controlled. Summit Construction Services, Greenscape Property Services, Martinez HVAC Solutions, and Coleman Legal Consulting were all registered to bank accounts in Vance's name. The UPS store mailboxes forwarded mail to his home address. The fake registered agent, Michael Torres, was his brother-in-law who'd signed business formation documents without understanding he was participating in fraud. The pattern was textbook embezzlement: create vendors that sound legitimate, write contracts that appear proper, submit invoices with just enough detail to seem real but not enough to verify, and rely on the assumption that nobody would actually check whether the work was being done. Pay yourself every month, maintain the fiction for as long as possible, and hope that by the time anyone noticed, you'd have enough money hidden to make prosecution difficult. What Vance hadn't counted on was someone with forensic accounting experience living in a house that overlooked his staging area. And he definitely hadn't counted on that someone having a dog that barked at late-night suspicious activity. The audit report had been turned over to local police, who'd opened a criminal investigation. Vance had been arrested 6 weeks after the HOA meeting, charged with theft, fraud, and forgery. His attorney had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was so overwhelming and well-documented that prosecutors weren't interested in reducing charges. The trial had been scheduled for next month, and the district attorney had asked me to testify as an expert witness about the fraud patterns and how I'd identified them. I'd agreed, though part of me felt bad about the role I'd play in sending someone to prison. But then I'd remember the 40 families whose HOA dues had been stolen, the trust that had been betrayed, and the harassment Sarah and I had endured because Vance wanted to eliminate the witness to his crimes. The embezzled money was being recovered through asset seizure. Vance had already spent about $80,000 on a new boat, a motorcycle, and home improvements to his house 3 towns over, where his wife apparently had no idea where the extra income was coming from. But the remaining $167,000 was sitting in accounts that were now frozen and would be returned to the HOA after legal proceedings concluded. The HOA board had been completely restructured. Linda Martinez had resigned, citing stress and embarrassment that she'd served alongside Vance without noticing the fraud. Tom Bradshaw had been elected president, with Carol Henderson coming out of retirement to serve as treasurer. 3 new board members had been added, including Mrs. Patterson, who'd made it her mission to ensure financial oversight would never again be lax enough to allow embezzlement. Their first official act had been passing new bylaws requiring quarterly financial reviews by an independent accountant, mandatory background checks for board members, and public posting of all vendor contracts with verification documentation. The second act had been formally apologizing to my family and naming Cooper the unofficial mascot of Oakmont Estates, complete with a plaque at the community center entrance. The plaque read, "In honor of Cooper, whose vigilance and loyalty reminded us to pay attention to what matters. Good dog." Sarah had cried when they'd unveiled it at a community meeting. Cooper had tried to sniff it, decided it wasn't food, and lost interest. But the gesture meant something to everyone who understood that a simple dog, doing normal dog things, had accidentally exposed corruption that could have continued for years. The community had changed in ways that went beyond financial policies and board restructuring. People talk to each other more now, not just surface-level pleasantries, but real conversations about concerns and questions. The assumption that board members were handling everything properly had been shattered, replaced by engaged oversight and active participation in HOA governance. Monthly meetings that used to attract maybe 5 residents now regularly drew 20 or more. Budget reviews that used to be rubber-stamped without discussion now generated questions and debate. Vendor contracts were scrutinized, work was verified, and the culture had shifted from passive trust to active verification. Some residents had approached me about running for the HOA board, but I'd declined. I'd done my part by exposing the fraud, and I had no desire to spend my semi-retirement managing neighborhood politics. I was content to work from home with Cooper at my feet, taking consulting jobs when they interested me, and occasionally helping the new board understand financial documents when they had questions. The Jenkins family had started a neighborhood tradition of Cooper's Walk, a weekly Saturday morning group dog walk through the subdivision. 15 to 20 dogs and their owners showed up regularly, creating the kind of community connection that HOA documents and rules could never manufacture. Cooper loved it, getting to socialize with other dogs while their humans talked about everything from lawn care to school districts to the ongoing Vance prosecution. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a community activist, channeling her anger about the embezzlement into advocacy for HOA transparency and resident rights. She'd started a blog documenting common HOA fraud patterns and how residents could protect themselves, using our story as the primary case study. Last I checked, it had over 10,000 followers across multiple HOA communities dealing with similar issues. The actual community center renovation was finally happening, funded by the recovered embezzlement money. Real contractors, with verifiable business licenses and insurance, working during normal hours, completing work you could actually see and touch. New flooring, updated lighting, fresh paint, and the accessible restrooms that residents had been requesting for years, but Vance had claimed were too expensive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The money that was supposed to renovate the community center had been stolen, and now the recovered stolen money was funding the renovation that should have happened 18 months ago. We'd come full circle, except now everyone was paying attention to whether the work was actually being completed. I'd maintained my surveillance camera setup on the back deck, though now I used it mostly to capture videos of Cooper doing adorable things rather than documenting fraud. Sarah had suggested turning the footage into a YouTube channel called Cooper's Daily Quiet Activities, but I wasn't sure the world needed videos of a golden retriever sleeping peacefully under a desk while his owner worked. Though sometimes I'd review the old footage from before the exposure, watching the late-night staging activities that had started this entire investigation. Vance and his accomplice arranging materials, taking photos, creating evidence for billing that would never have been questioned if not for a dog barking at the wrong moment and an owner who knew what financial fraud looked like. Tom Bradshaw had asked me to speak at a regional HOA conference about fraud detection and prevention. I'd agreed, preparing a presentation that walked through how I'd identified the red flags, what questions residents should ask about HOA finances, and why active oversight mattered more than trusting authority figures to do the right thing. People assume HOA boards are filled with volunteers who just want to serve their community, I'd told the audience of about 200 HOA presidents and board members. And most of the time, that's true. But positions of authority attract people with agendas, and financial controls exist because trusting someone's good intentions isn't enough. Verify the work, audit the books, and pay attention when things don't add up. I'd shown them Cooper's photo, explaining how a dog complaint that made no sense had been the first red flag that something was wrong. When authority figures make accusations that don't match observable reality, ask why. What's the real agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? In our case, the dog complaint was harassment designed to distract and pressure us because we had the wrong house in the wrong location at the wrong time. The presentation had been well received, generating questions that lasted 45 minutes past the scheduled time slot. Several attendees had approached me afterward with their own stories of suspected fraud or financial irregularities, asking for guidance on how to investigate without making false accusations. I'd given them the same advice my first forensic accounting mentor had given me 20 years ago. Follow the money. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts but verify everything with documentation. Build cases on facts, not feelings. The local news had covered the story extensively, though I'd declined most interview requests after the initial reporting. The headline, "Dogs Barking Exposes HOA Embezzlement," had been picked up by national media, turning Cooper into a minor celebrity. We'd received interview requests from morning shows, podcast invitations, and even an offer from a publisher interested in a book about HOA fraud using our story as the framework. I'd said no to most of it, but had agreed to work with a legal journalist writing a comprehensive article about HOA governance failures and how residents could protect themselves. The article would feature our case alongside several others, creating a resource for people who suspected problems but didn't know how to document them properly. Richard Vance's wife had filed for divorce 2 months after his arrest. According to neighborhood gossip that I tried not to pay attention to but couldn't entirely avoid, she'd had no idea about the embezzlement and was devastated to discover her husband's new boat and home improvements were funded by stolen money. She'd cooperated fully with prosecutors, providing documentation about household finances that helped trace where the stolen money had gone. Part of me felt sympathy for her and their adult children, who'd done nothing wrong but would carry the stigma of their father's crimes. But mostly, I felt sympathy for the 40 families in Oakmont Estates who'd trusted a volunteer to manage their money and had that trust betrayed in the most calculated way possible. The financial impact had been significant for some residents. The HOA had been forced to suspend non-essential spending while waiting for recovered funds, which meant delaying some planned improvements and asking for patience while legal proceedings played out. A few residents had faced legitimate financial hardship from the situation, and the new board had worked with them on payment plans and temporary dues adjustments. But the community had rallied in ways that surprised everyone. Residents with skills in landscaping, maintenance, and repairs had volunteered time to handle work the HOA would normally pay contractors for. The annual community barbecue had turned into a fundraiser for legal expenses, raising $8,000 through donations and auction items. People who'd never spoken to each other before Vance's exposure were now organizing work parties and supporting each other through a difficult period. "It's like we had to lose trust to learn how to trust properly," Carol Henderson had said during one of our coffee meetings. "We trusted Vance because he was in a position of authority, but we didn't verify. Now we trust each other because we're actively participating and holding each other accountable. That's healthier, even if it's more work." She was right. The pre-fraud Oakmont Estates had been quiet, orderly, and functioning based on assumptions that authority figures were handling everything properly. The post-fraud Oakmont Estates was messier, more engaged, and functioning based on active participation and oversight. It required more effort from residents, but it created genuine community rather than just geographical proximity. Cooper had become the unofficial symbol of that transformation. Residents who'd never owned dogs were stopping to pet him during walks. Kids asked their parents if they could get a dog, like the one who caught the bad guy, and his gentle presence had become synonymous with vigilance and loyalty. The trial was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. The district attorney had been confident about a conviction based on the overwhelming documentation, but Vance's defense attorney was apparently planning to argue that the fake vendor setup was a misunderstanding rather than intentional fraud, that Vance had been trying to save the HOA money through creative accounting rather than steal from it. I'd reviewed the defense strategy with prosecutors and found it laughable. Creating 4 shell companies with fake registered agents, billing for work that didn't exist, staging late-night activities to create false evidence, and harassing a resident who might notice the fraud wasn't creative accounting. It was textbook embezzlement with harassment and retaliation added on top. "They're going to try to make you look like you had a vendetta," the prosecutor had warned me, "like you manufactured this fraud accusation because you were angry about the dog complaint. Be prepared for aggressive cross-examination, questioning your motives and expertise." "Let them question my expertise," I'd replied. I spent 20 years building fraud cases for corporations and law enforcement. My credentials and case history speak for themselves, and my motives were simple. Someone accused my dog of something he didn't do, which made me look closer at HOA operations, which revealed fraud that needed to be exposed. Cause and effect, documented every step of the way. Sarah had been less sanguine about my upcoming testimony, worried that defense attorneys would try to make me look bad or twist my investigation into something suspicious. But I'd testified in fraud cases before, knew how cross-examination worked, and wasn't worried about defending analysis that was thorough, well-documented, and objectively correct. The afternoon before I was scheduled to testify, I took Cooper for a long walk through the neighborhood, past the community center where actual renovation work was visible, past homes where residents waved and called out greetings, past the entrance where his plaque reminded everyone that vigilance and loyalty mattered. "You know what's funny, buddy?" I said, knowing he couldn't understand but enjoying the one-sided conversation anyway. "You just wanted to alert us about strangers near our house doing something unusual late at night. Basic dog stuff. You had no idea those strangers were staging fake construction evidence. No idea your barking was interrupting a fraud operation. No idea your owner would recognize financial patterns and start investigating." Cooper wagged his tail, probably hoping this conversation would lead to treats. "You were just being a good dog." And somehow that was exactly what this neighborhood needed. Someone paying attention, someone noticing when things didn't add up, someone caring enough to bark when something felt wrong. We walked past the Jenkins house, where their kids were playing in the yard with their new puppy, a rescue they'd adopted after being inspired by Cooper's story. Past Mrs. Patterson's house, where she was working in her garden and called out asking if we'd be at Saturday's community walk. Past Carol Henderson's house, where she was sitting on her porch reviewing HOA financial reports, because that's what treasurers do when they take oversight seriously. The neighborhood felt different now, not perfect, still dealing with the aftermath of betrayal and theft, but healthier, more honest, more engaged, less willing to accept authority without question, more willing to verify trust through participation. And it had started with a dog complaint that didn't make sense, filed by someone who'd made the catastrophic mistake of trying to pressure a forensic accountant whose career had been built on following money and exposing fraud. Back home, I found Sarah setting up a new dog bed in my office, this one with extra padding and Cooper's name embroidered on the side. "I figured he earned an upgrade," she explained, "since he's apparently the neighborhood hero now." "He's always been the hero," I corrected. The neighborhood just took a while to notice. Cooper investigated his new bed, circled it 3 times, and settled down with a contented sigh. Within 2 minutes, he was asleep, dreaming whatever dreams quiet golden retrievers dream when they're not accidentally exposing embezzlement schemes. I sat at my desk, pulled up my testimony notes for the trial, and made sure every detail was documented and defendable. 20 years of forensic accounting had taught me that the best testimony wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was thorough and factual. Let the evidence speak, let the numbers tell the story, and let juries reach conclusions based on documentation rather than rhetoric. Richard Vance had stolen $247,000 from his neighbors over 18 months. He'd created fake companies, submitted fraudulent invoices, and harassed residents who might notice his crimes. Those were facts, documented and verifiable, regardless of what defense attorneys tried to argue about creative accounting or misunderstandings. And it had all unraveled because one quiet golden retriever had barked at suspicious activity, and his owner had the skills to understand what he was seeing when he started paying attention. The trial would happen, Vance would likely be convicted, the neighborhood would continue healing, and life would return to something approaching normal. But normal was different now, better in ways that came from hard lessons about trust, verification, and the importance of paying attention when things didn't add up. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradshaw. "Board meeting next Tuesday, discussing community center reopening plans. Would love your input on vendor verification procedures. Also, Cooper is invited. He's board mascot now, apparently has voting rights according to the Jenkins kids." I smiled, texting back confirmation. Then looked down at Cooper, sleeping peacefully in his upgraded bed, completely unaware of his elevated status in neighborhood governance. "You're going to need a suit," I told him. "Can't attend board meetings as mascot looking like a regular dog." His tail thumped once in his sleep, probably chasing dream rabbits, definitely not concerned with board meeting attire or vendor verification procedures. 3 weeks later, I testified at Richard Vance's trial. The prosecution walked me through my investigation timeline, the red flags I'd identified, the methodology I'd used to trace fraudulent billing patterns. I explained shell company structures, fake vendor indicators, and how staging activities create false evidence for non-existent work. Defense cross-examination tried to paint me as someone with a vendetta, someone who'd manufactured fraud accusations out of anger about a dog complaint. But when they asked about my professional credentials, I walked them through 20 years of fraud investigation experience, dozens of successful prosecutions, and expert witness testimony in multiple federal cases. When they suggested my analysis was biased, I offered to walk the jury through every transaction, every document, every piece of evidence that led to my conclusions, offered to explain, in excruciating detail, exactly how embezzlement patterns work and why Vance's activities matched those patterns perfectly. They declined, realizing that challenging my expertise would just give me more time to educate the jury about fraud detection. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, found Richard Vance guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later, with prosecutors recommending significant prison time given the calculated nature of the theft and the breach of community trust. Oakmont Estates residents who'd attended the trial gathered in the parking lot afterward, some crying, some angry, all relieved that justice was being served. Mrs. Patterson hugged me fiercely, thanking me again for having the skills and courage to investigate when something didn't feel right. "You gave us our community back," she said. "It's damaged, it's different, but it's honest now. That matters." Driving home, I thought about how random everything had been. If we'd bought a different house, if Cooper had been a quiet indoor dog who didn't bark at unusual activity, if I'd been in any other career besides forensic accounting, Richard Vance might still be stealing from the HOA, creating fake invoices, paying himself every month while residents trusted that their volunteer board president was handling everything properly. But we'd bought this house. Cooper was a normal dog who barked at suspicious activity, and I had exactly the right skills to recognize fraud when I saw it. Random chance, or maybe just the universe's way of making sure someone was paying attention. Cooper was waiting at the door when we got home, tail wagging, ready for dinner and evening walks and all the ordinary routines that made up his uncomplicated dog life. I gave him extra treats, scratched behind his ears, and told him he'd done good work, even though he had no idea what any of this meant. "Good boy, Cooper," I said. Same words I'd said 1,000 times before, but with deeper appreciation now for what they represented. "Very good boy." His tail wagged harder because praise and treats were all the reward he needed for accidentally exposing fraud, becoming a neighborhood hero, and reminding 40 families that vigilance and loyalty matter more than blind trust in authority. Sometimes the biggest impacts come from the smallest actions: a dog barking at the right moment, an owner paying attention, a willingness to investigate when something doesn't add up, and the courage to expose truth even when it's uncomfortable, inconvenient, or threatens powerful people who'd prefer you stay quiet. Richard Vance had tried to silence that vigilance with a fake dog complaint, creating the very pressure that led to his exposure. He'd tried to force out the witness whose house overlooked his staging area, not realizing that witness was the exact wrong person to threaten with baseless accusations. And now, he was facing prison time, while Cooper slept peacefully on his expensive new dog bed, living his best life as the unofficial mascot of an HOA that had learned, the hard way, that trust without verification is just an invitation for betrayal. If you're still here, if you followed this story from absurd dog complaint to fraud exposure to justice served, let me ask you something. When have you questioned authority that didn't make sense? When have you paid attention to details others overlooked? When have you trusted your instincts that something was wrong, even when everyone else seemed comfortable? Because that's what this story is really about. Not a dog, not embezzlement, not HOA drama. It's about the importance of paying attention, questioning narratives that don't match reality, and having the courage to investigate when something feels off. Cooper couldn't speak, couldn't explain what he'd noticed, couldn't articulate why late-night activity at the community center seemed wrong. But he barked anyway, did his job as a good dog protecting his territory, and trusted that his humans would understand. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. Pay attention, raise the alarm when something seems wrong, and trust that someone with the right skills will investigate properly. And if you happen to be the person with the right skills, then you have a responsibility to dig deeper, document thoroughly, and expose truth even when it's uncomfortable. That's what forensic accountants do. That's what good neighbors do. And apparently, that's what quiet golden retrievers do when they're just trying to alert their humans about suspicious late-night activity. Take care of yourselves. Pay attention to the details that don't add up. And remember that sometimes the most important skill isn't knowing everything, it's knowing when to ask questions. Thanks for being here. Share this if someone you know is dealing with HOA issues or suspected financial irregularities, and give your own dogs extra treats because they're paying attention even when we're not. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never underestimate what one good dog and an attentive owner can accomplish when they refuse to accept narratives that don't match reality.